The night everyone remembers is the one they pretend not to. Friday lights humming over a small town field, the kind of glow that makes people feel safe, the kind that convinces parents to look away for just a moment. A teenage boy walked out of a football stadium surrounded by noise, laughter, and familiar faces, and he was never seen again. What the town tells itself is simple. What the ground beneath it remembers is not. Because this wasn't a disappearance. It was an exposure, and they say the game ended clean. Final whistle, score settled. Students spilled into the parking lot like a tide receding, engine starting, radios turning on. The boy, 16, quiet, dependable, texted his mother that he was on his way. That message is still there, time stamped untouched. It is the last thing he ever sent. By morning, his bed was empty. By noon, his face was on every screen in town. By nightfall, the search began to feel ceremonial, as if everyone already sensed where the truth would refuse to go. And this was a place that trusted rituals. Church on Sundays, flags on porches, the same families owning the same land for generations. The kind of town where secrets don't disappear, they're inherited. When deputies knocked on doors, people answered politely. When questions got uncomfortable, memories softened. I didn't see him. I left early. Kids wander. The language of distance settled in fast, like dust after a parade. And the stadium cameras failed at the worst moment. The parking lot footage skipped a narrow window. A friend remembered a conversation but not the words. Another remembered the words but not the faces. And in that gap, rumors did what rumors always do. They circled something real without daring to name it. A car no one recognized. A road that leads to old property. A meeting that wasn't supposed to happen. And because beneath the official timeline, another clock was ticking. One that started long before kickoff. Weeks earlier, the boy had been asking questions. About a name in an old yearbook. About a property line that didn't make sense. About a family friend who appeared in too many photos and too few stories. His curiosity was gentle, almost apologetic. But curiosity in a town like this can feel like accusation, and search dogs traced his scent to the edge of the lot, then stopped as if the ground itself refused to carry him further. Phone pings placed him somewhere he had no reason to be. And then there was the meeting, brief, deliberate, witnessed only by shadows and one person who would later insist it never happened at all. And what vanished that night wasn't just a teenager. It was a carefully balanced lie, and once a lie is disturbed, it doesn't collapse loudly. It leaks, slowly, patiently, waiting for someone brave or foolish enough to follow the stain backward to its source. And by the second week, the town stopped searching outward and began folding inward. The roads were covered. The woods were calmed. Drones flew over creeks that hadn't moved in decades. What remained untouched were the homes that had always been assumed innocent. The ones with family names carved into stone at the cemetery. The ones that hosted fundraisers, sponsored jerseys, and sat closest to the church. And the boy's locker became a shrine, candles, notes, photographs that tried to freeze him at an age before questions. His parents spoke in careful sentences, choosing words like they were stepping through glass. They said he trusted people easily, that he believed adults when they smiled, that he had never run from home, never broken rules, never disappeared before. And yet, quietly, investigators began to notice something unsettling. He hadn't vanished randomly, he had moved with purpose. A recovered phone log revealed a call placed minutes after the game ended. It wasn't to a friend, it wasn't to family. It was to a number saved under a name that didn't exist in school records. No last name, no profile picture, just a first name that appeared nowhere else in his digital life. The call lasted 42 seconds, long enough to confirm, short enough to avoid explanation. And when deputies traced the number, it led back to a burner phone purchased with cash. But cash leaves its own kind of trail. A clerk remembered the buyer. Middle-aged, local, polite, the kind of man people greet by habit. The kind of man no one expects to see twice in the same story. And then there was the location ping, a narrow strip of land just outside town limits, private property, long owned, rarely visited, a place locals described as nothing out there. But history has a way of speaking through nothing. Old maps showed something once stood there, not a house, not a business, a meeting place. One that disappeared from records around the same time certain names stopped appearing in public documents. And the boy had been there before. Soil on his shoes matched the composition. A photograph on his phone, taken weeks earlier, showed a fence line at dusk. No caption, no explanation, just proof that he had been looking. And people who look too closely tend to see what others have worked very hard to bury, and whispers grew sharper. This wasn't about drugs, or gangs, or a runaway fantasy. This was about recognition. About a teenager realizing that the stories he'd been told didn't align with the faces he saw on old photographs. About a meeting arranged not in panic but in control, and someone had agreed to speak with him that night. Someone who believed the conversation could end quietly. Someone who underestimated how heavy truth becomes when it finally has a witness. And in towns like this, witnesses don't disappear on accident. They are managed, redirected, absorbed, until the silence feels natural again, and the meeting, according to the version that would later surface, was meant to be brief, a conversation to clear things up. That phrase appeared again and again in interviews, always spoken by different mouths with the same tone. Calm, reasonable, almost rehearsed. It was the language of adults who believed they could still control the narrative, and the location was chosen for privacy, not distance. Close enough to return unnoticed, far enough to avoid interruption. The boy arrived on foot, following directions sent minutes earlier. No car, no witnesses who would admit to watching him cross the road. But one neighbor, half asleep and restless, would later recall seeing a figure under a streetlight waiting. A taller figure, older still, and phone data places them together for exactly 11 minutes. 11 minutes that do not exist on any official timeline. 11 minutes where no calls were made, no messages sent, no cameras functioned properly. Just two people standing on inherited ground, speaking about something that had been held too long. And what was said there can only be inferred. But what followed tells its own story. The boy's phone moved suddenly, fast enough to suggest panic. Then it stopped, not powered down, just still, as if set somewhere carefully, as if someone wanted it found, but not followed. And when investigators finally searched the property weeks later, they claimed to find nothing of value. No evidence of a struggle, no clothing, no blood, but absence can be staged, especially by people who know exactly where to look and where not to, and old residents began to remember things they hadn't thought about in years. A similar disappearance in the late 90s. A fire labeled accidental. A woman who left town after asking the wrong questions. None of these memories appeared in official records. They lived only in the way conversations stopped when certain names were mentioned, and the boy's family started receiving advice they never asked for. Suggestions to let the process work, to stop digging, to protect what's left. Protection, in this context, meant compliance. Silence dressed up as concern, and then there was the man. The one whose name never appeared on camera, but whose presence lingered at every search update. He stood just behind the crowd, close enough to hear, far enough to avoid being seen. When questioned, he offered help. When pressed, he smiled, the kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes, and a single piece of footage would later resurface. Not from that night, but from a week before. It showed the boy outside a local archive, flipping through microfilm, pausing on a family tree that connected too many dots. His finger traced a line, he leaned back. And for the first time, he looked afraid, and whatever he learned didn't just threaten one person. It threatened a structure, a lineage, a story that required constant maintenance to survive. And stories like that do not forgive witnesses. And by the time federal interest was quietly declined, the town had already decided what it needed to forget. The case remained open in name only, a file that grew heavier without growing closer to truth. Tips slowed, posters faded. The boy's face became familiar in the way unresolved things often do, present but no longer urgent. And that was the point, and what replaced urgency was ritualized grief. Annual vigils, carefully worded anniversaries, speeches about community strength that never mentioned responsibility. The language shifted from questions to endurance, from what happened to we heal. Healing in this context meant sealing the wound without cleaning it, but beneath that surface pressure was building. A former deputy, recently retired and suddenly talkative, admitted something over drinks that would later be denied in daylight. He said the meeting was known, not officially, not on paper, but understood. He said a call had come in that night, asking for patience. He said certain doors were never opened because the people behind them had built the town itself. And financial records told a similar story. Donations surged in the weeks after the disappearance, quiet transfers routed through foundations and trusts. Money meant for scholarships, stadium repairs, historical preservation. It was framed as generosity. But generosity, when timed precisely, can function like a muzzle. And the boy's mother noticed it first. How conversations changed when she entered a room. How sympathy arrived prepackaged, always followed by a suggestion to rest, to move, to start over somewhere else. Persistence was not, and then came the anonymous letter. No return address, no threats, just a photocopy of a document she had never seen before. A land deed from decades earlier, a name crossed out, another written in. The ink slightly different, the implication unmistakable. Her son hadn't stumbled into a secret, he had inherited proximity to one, and that document matched what the boy had been researching. The archive visit, the family tree, the missing names. He had noticed the pattern that others had normalized. How certain families appeared everywhere, boards, plaques, endowments, while others vanished between census lines. He had realized that disappearance wasn't always violent. Sometimes it was administrative, and a journalist tried to pursue the angle. Requests were made, calls returned late, if at all. Advertisers pulled out. An editor suggested a different story, something safer, something with an ending, and what remained was the meeting itself. The thing no one would describe, but everyone adjusted their behavior around. It became a gravitational center, unnamed, unrecorded, but powerful enough to bend truth away from it. And then somewhere beneath that land, beneath the silence and the money and the rituals, something was still waiting. Not evidence, not a body, but acknowledgement. And because the most disturbing thing about this story isn't that a teenager went missing, it's that an entire town knew why and chose to live with it, and by the 5th year, the case had aged into folklore. Teenagers who never knew him spoke his name like a cautionary tale. Adults referenced the night in lowered voices, as if volume itself could trigger consequences. The town had learned how to remember without acknowledging, how to grieve without confronting. But history does not forget simply because people ask it to, and what finally shifted things wasn't a confession, it was erosion, a slow failure of loyalty. The man believed to have met the boy that night began to unravel, not publicly but privately. Health declined, finances thinned. The circle that once protected him grew smaller, and when protection fades, memory returns, and a storage unit was abandoned. Inside it, among ordinary debris, were boxes of paper that should never have existed, old correspondence drafts, photographs with dates that didn't align with public records. One image in particular stood out, a group of men standing on that same strip of land decades earlier, same posture, same quiet authority, and in the corner of the frame, barely visible, a boy who looked unsettlingly familiar, and the implication was unbearable. This wasn't a single act. It was a tradition, not ritualized, not spoken aloud, but repeated. The removal of inconvenient bloodlines, the reassignment of names, the careful editing of family trees so power could pass unchallenged. The meeting after the football game wasn't spontaneous. It was corrective, and the boy had been called there not to be reasoned with, but to be assessed, to see if he could be folded back into silence, to determine whether curiosity could be neutralized. When it couldn't, the system responded the only way it knew how, and the documents never made it to court. They disappeared into custody, then into storage, then into rumor. But the weight of them changed the way certain people slept, changed the way others drank, changed the way some avoided mirrors, and if you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline, and the boy's father stopped attending vigils? Not because he had given up, but because he had understood. Justice wasn't coming from outside. It never had. The town didn't need to be exposed. It needed to be witnessed. And sometimes the most powerful act isn't revealing a secret. It's refusing to let it rest, and the land still sits there, unmarked, undisturbed. Children drive past it without knowing why their parents tense. Dogs still stop at its edge. Phones still lose signal. And somewhere beneath layers of paperwork and polite denial, the truth waits, not to be found, but to be carried. And because the past doesn't stay buried, it chooses its witnesses carefully. And there is a point in every buried story where silence stops being passive and becomes deliberate. That point arrived when a former county clerk, cleaning out a home before selling it, hesitated over a locked drawer that didn't belong to the furniture. Inside were copies of records that should have been destroyed years earlier. Census adjustments, adoption filings without children, death certificates issued without bodies. The handwriting matched across decades, steady and confident, as if the person signing believed permanence was their birthright. And one name appeared again, the same first name the boy had saved in his phone, not as a guardian, not as family, as a contact of resolution. That phrase was never meant to be read by anyone outside the system that created it. It implied a problem already solved, a loose end already tied, and the clerk didn't go to the police, not out of fear but experience. Instead, the copies were mailed anonymously to 3 places. Only one acknowledged receipt, quietly, without promises, without follow-up. Sometimes institutions don't act because they can't. Sometimes they don't act because acting would expose how long they've known. And around that time, people began to leave town. Not all at once. One family here, another there. Houses sold below value. Land returned to trusts. It looked like coincidence until it didn't. The older generation was thinning, and with them, the shared discipline of silence. What remained were younger inheritors who understood the benefits but not the cost. And the boy's name resurfaced online in places the town didn't control. Forums, comment sections, long threads where strangers noticed patterns locals refused to see. The meeting after the game, the land, the repeated erasures. Outsiders asked simple questions that insiders had trained themselves not to answer, and then still no arrests came, no public reckoning. Because the truth of this story isn't hidden behind one locked door. It's distributed, fragmented across families, records and favors. No single person holds it all. That's how it survives. And the boy's mother keeps one thing on her desk now. Not a photo, not a document, a printed copy of that last text. On my way. She says it wasn't a lie. He was on his way, just not to where he thought. And history often teaches us that monsters look dramatic, obvious, loud. But the real ones wear familiarity. They attend games, shake hands, sponsor plaques. And when they erase someone, they do it so cleanly that the absence feels earned. And this story doesn't end with justice. It ends with inheritance. With a question passed forward unanswered. How many times can a place choose itself over a child before the ground refuses to hold the weight? And the final truth, the one no document can hold, is this: the boy was not taken by chaos. He was taken by order, by a system so old it no longer remembers why it exists, only that it must continue. That is what makes this story difficult to face. Not the cruelty, but the calm. And in towns like this, history isn't written, it's curated. Painful chapters are thinned, footnoted, or quietly removed. What remains is a version of the past that feels stable enough to live inside. The boy threatened that stability simply by noticing, by tracing lines that others had learned to step around, by asking why certain names echoed through generations while others vanished like breath in cold air. And there was no dramatic ending, no sound that carried through the night, just a decision made efficiently by people who believed they were protecting something larger than one life. They told themselves it was necessary, that it had always been done this way, that the town survived because of choices like this. And perhaps that's the most disturbing part. The town did survive. Football games continued. Children grew up. New families moved in, unaware of the ground they stood on. The system adjusted, as systems do. It absorbed the loss and redistributed the silence. But history keeps its own records. And every so often, a kid will ask a question that doesn't fit the answer they're given. A map won't line up. A name will feel wrong. A story will pause too long before continuing, and when that happens, the past leans closer. Not to warn, but to see who notices, and the boy's disappearance was meant to close a loop. Instead, it revealed one, a cycle of correction masquerading as tradition. A meeting after a football game that exposed how fragile power becomes when it's inherited rather than earned. And this isn't a story about a missing teen. It's about what happens when belonging is conditional, when bloodlines are managed, when truth is treated like a contaminant instead of a responsibility, and somewhere the land still waits, not for justice, not for closure, but for recognition. Because places like this don't fear exposure, they fear memory. And now you're part of it, and you've seen what was never meant to be archived. You've walked the edges of a story that survives because people look away. The question is no longer what happened to the boy, and the question is what happens when the next one starts asking, and whether anyone will choose differently. And if this story stayed with you, it's because it was meant to. History doesn't ask permission before it repeats itself. It only asks whether anyone is paying attention.